Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Institute of Policy Studies, Pakistan, for this very kind invitation. Israeli aggression against the Palestinians and Arabs predates the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. This is something that is not often highlighted. That even before the Second World War, the introduction of migrant population from Europe, population of Jews from Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe into Palestine and the surrounding areas, met with resistance from the indigenous Palestinian people and the Arab population. And this infiltration of European Jews who were not really part of the Jews of West Asia in the real sense of the term, but they were Jews from outside, who lived outside Jerusalem and Palestine for ages, and whose link with the Jewish population and Judaism is something that is suspect. Jews of this sort, Jews who may have come from different origins and different backgrounds, something we may not want to go into detail, but nonetheless it is quite well known that these Jews of Eastern Europe, part of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement, they were the ones who began to move into Palestine. And the one important factor that contributed to this was, of course, the Balfour Declaration of 1978. It was under the guise of the Balfour Declaration, the British promising the Jews, international Jews, Jews from Europe, that they would find a home in Palestine, and a home would be created for them, basically under the aegis of colonial rule. So it was British colonialism helping to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine without the consent of the Palestinian people, and facilitating the infiltration, the emergence of a Jewish community in Palestine that was in some ways not really linked to the foundations of Jewish society, but that's how it happened. More and more Jews came, settled down in Palestine, bought land in many instances, and in some instances they usurped the land if there was no gas. And this is how the Jewish community developed in Palestine. And then, of course, there was the Holocaust in Europe. Europe, basically, Hitler's Germany and, other elements in European society that conducted this pogrom against the Jews. And we know this was a terrible thing that happened. A huge number of Jews were killed, wiped out. Those who weren't, some of them made their way to Jerusalem. It was facilitated by the Zionist movement in Europe. Right from the beginning, the Arabs and the Palestinians resisted this. Even when they were buying land, even when they were forming small groups and so on, they resisted this. They did not want people who were not part of Palestine. It is not rejecting Jews as such, it's rejecting people who were not really part of that region. The indigenous Jews who were part of that region, there was no problem. They had always been part of that region. Jews had remained there. And the Arabs, Muslims and Christians, they were able to live with these Jews. This wasn't a problem. The problem was with the Jews that came from outside. It was basically a problem of colonization from outside. It's a problem of a people who had links with colonial rule. And this was the reason for the resistance from the Arabs and the Palestinians. The huge resistance in 1936, which was suppressed by the British, who had power over Palestine as a result of the mandate that was given to them by the League of Nations. They suppressed the uprising of the Palestinian people against these foreign elements. And it went on for a while, but it was crushed by British rule with the help of Israelis and Zionists. After the creation of Israel in 1948, it became much worse. What we know as the Nakba, the catastrophe, started actually in 1948. It was on a massive scale. Palestinians were killed, they were expelled, evicted from Palestinian land. Whole villages were demolished, villages were taken over, restructured by the Zionist rulers, or those who emerged as rulers in Palestine. It was a terrible period in history. And it was not just those who were killed, there were others who were expelled, tortured, imprisoned. The Palestinians rightly saw this as the beginning of their nightmare, the Nakba. There was aggression, unvarnished, aggression which had no element of humanity in it. It was terrible. And the Palestinians paid the price at that time. Now, what I've been asked to look at in this presentation is not so much Israeli aggression. We are aware of it. It's happened all the while. It continues to happen. Even what happened a few days ago at Al-Aqsa, it's part of a continuous process that we are aware of. And even in the case of Al-Aqsa, it is not as if it's the first time they did it. We know it has happened before. Muslims at worship during the month of Ramadan being harassed, evicted, treated in a very inhuman manner. It is not new. It has happened before. So it's not the aggression that we are concerned about so much, though we know about it and we will always keep it at the back of our minds. We're talking of resistance. There's this view that resistance is weakened, that the response is weakened. This is not really true. It is the form of resistance that has changed, the form of resistance that has taken on a different character. This is what we have to try to understand. At the beginning, 1948, it was the resistance of Arab states and the Palestinian people. A number of states were all part of the collective resistance. They were against what was happening. They put up a fight. They failed. At the same time, we know that other things happened in the name of resistance. There were Palestinian freedom fighters who hijacked planes, who staged what were attempts to demonstrate the strength and the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause by perhaps raiding certain places, events, certain episodes that took place. There was bloodshed. This was in the initial phase. We know what had happened in the case of the Olympics, and so on. So there was Palestinian and Arab resistance. It's wrong to say that they didn't resist. Right from the beginning. Ever since the Balfour Declaration, and even before that, they'd resisted this attempt to usurp Palestinian lands and evict Palestinians. And in many instances to kill them. But that resistance didn't work. And this is one of the reasons why the form of resistance changed. States resisting Palestinian rule, states resisting Israeli rule over Palestine, these states after a while decided that it would not work. They were too weak. They could not resist the power of the Israeli state, which was backed by the United States of America and indirectly by other European powers. They knew that it was not possible. And it's a weakening of that sort of resistance that many Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians were concerned about. States were not putting up an armed resistance. They were not fighting the military power that was Israel and the United States of America and the other forces that supported this oppression of the Palestinian people, this dispossession of the Palestinian people. So that resistance changed because it was not working. And later on, they realized that hijackings, attempts to provide a demonstrative effect to the Palestinian cause, dramatic effect to the Palestinian cause, was also not working. And they became disillusioned with it. And this is what led to yet another phase in the Palestinian struggle. And that is the phase that we are concerned about. A lot of Palestinians realized that maybe the method had to change. They had to find other ways of resisting oppression, of resisting their expulsion and eviction. And some of these new methods were largely nonviolent, and they seem to have some impact. It's the culmination to this process. In the 1990s, we had the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which is a Palestinian movement, indigenous, created by the Palestinians themselves, as a way of fighting Israeli oppression and Israeli attempts to usurp their rights. And that movement is still on. And that is a movement that is gaining in strength. So when you talk about the weakening response, we must not forget this, that at the same time the response had become stronger in another form, a non-violent form, a form related to sanctions and divestments and boycotts. Today you find that the number of European business entities that are part of this BDS movement, there are also other groups that are supporting it, universities and think tanks and so on in the West that are supporting this movement. And it is a movement that has become quite formidable. So formidable that the Israeli government is very worried about this. And they have taken all sorts of ruthless measures to suppress this movement. At the same time, I think Palestinians realize that they should use international avenues that were available, even if these avenues were in the control of the oppressor, the Zionist oppressor and its backer, the United States of America. For instance, they discovered that the UN could play some role. There's a special committee in the UN that focuses upon Palestinian rights. Palestine today has got a UN status of sorts. It's not a member because it is not a nation state. It's not a member of the UN, but it has got the same status as the Vatican, if you like, in the UN, which means that it is a group that is recognized, there's a voice, it sits in a number of committees, agencies, affiliates of the UN structure. And that helps because that keeps the struggle going and it focuses upon the nonviolent dimension of the struggle, the diplomatic dimension of the struggle which expresses itself through ways that are acceptable to a lot of people. And that is important. It has strengthened the Palestinian struggle through the UN and the channels linked to the UN. That plus BDS, these have been two very important dimensions of the struggle. And a third dimension, which has been there all along, it's become stronger, and perhaps this is a dimension that should become even stronger in the future. It is basically raising consciousness at the mass level, in the different languages and cultures of the peoples of the world. In other words, making people aware of what this Palestinian struggle is all about, because justice is on the side of the Palestinians and all those who support the Palestinian cause. And it's a struggle for justice that is not that well known. There are a lot of people who don't know the origins of what has happened. They don't know how the Zionist movement developed and the injustices that are perpetrated upon the Palestinians. They're not even aware of this because the global media is in the hands of the oppressor. It's in the hands of the United States and the Zionist movement. So you have a very big task ahead of you, which is to make people aware that there is justice that has to be done, that this struggle is a legitimate struggle, that this is a struggle which has got a very powerful moral dimension, which is the reason why Nelson Mandela once described the Palestinian struggle as the most moral struggle of our time. And it's true. There is this dimension that most people are not aware of. And we have to make more and more people aware of this in a way in which they would be able to empathize with this movement and regard this as the movement of our time. There are people who have compared the struggle against Israeli injustice and oppression to apartheid in South Africa. In a sense, it's right. I mean, if you're talking about apartheid Israel, of course, the Israeli system is based upon apartheid. It is a terrible injustice. There's discrimination which is so vile and violent. All that is true. But you cannot get the same degree of response from people against the Israelis and against the United States of America and against the Europeans who support Israel. You cannot get the same degree of support that people got in the fight against apartheid. Why? Because the Zionist movement is powerful. Why? Because the United States, which supported apartheid, as we know, when it was at its peak, at its pinnacle, the difference is that here it's the United States supporting the Israeli cause because it is linked to vested interests within the United States itself. We know that. How the Zionists control the US Senate, House of Representatives. We know they control with the media, universities. We know how they control civil society. We know how they control Hollywood, the film industry. We know all this. So it's, in a sense, different because the grip that the Zionists and the United States of America, they have over this struggle, the struggle of the Palestinians, is so different. Apartheid, the struggle against apartheid, noble struggle, but it was in some ways easier than the struggle against Zionism and against US imperialism. And I want to conclude by saying that there is also something else that makes it different. Today we know that US imperialism, US hegemony is on the decline. And this makes all the difference. I see this as the vital factor that will change the struggle of the Palestinians. That the force that supports the Israeli movement and Israeli oppression, the force that supports Zionism internationally, that force is getting weaker and weaker. That force is the United States of America and the West as a whole. The West, the United States of America, they no longer call the shots. And that makes all the difference as far as our struggle is concerned. We have to understand this. We have to ensure that we don't make mistakes. And what would be some of these mistakes? If suddenly you find that the Palestinians, the Arabs who are fighting this noble cause, they indulge in senseless, mindless violence. That's going to discredit the struggle. One has to ensure that the struggle is noble, that the means are noble and the ends are noble. You cannot separate means from ends. And that is so important in the Palestinian struggle. Make sure that the means are noble and the ends are noble. And the ends, we know what they are. It is the liberation of the Palestinians, self-determination, establishment of a Palestinian state. And in the end, of course, the Palestinians and others, including the Jews who live there, they have to decide what the future will be. But whatever the future, it will be a future which must embody the nobility and the purity of this struggle. And we have to make sure that we understand the dynamics of the stage. It's a very critical moment, a very, very critical moment in the struggle. And we can destroy it if we adopt the wrong approaches. If out of our frustration we say, look, let's adopt more and more violent methods, because those methods are adopted by the oppressor, and we have to retaliate, and we have to do what the oppressor is doing, that would be a mistake. We have to outdo the oppressor. And one way of outdoing the oppressor is to emphasize the very principles of the struggle, which are noble. It's a struggle which is based upon peace, justice. It is based upon the integrity of the human family, the oneness of all of us, including the Jews and the Christians and everyone else. It is inclusive, it is universal. We have to emphasize that and demonstrate this in our struggle. Remember the ancient saying of the Afghans, and you find this among the Chinese and almost all cultures, the saying that you cannot fight fire with fire. You cannot wipe out blood by using blood. It's another commodity, it is another force that they have to use in order to get rid of this terrible disaster that has overcome the Palestinian people. The Nakba can be overcome, but it will be overcome because we are deeply attached to a struggle that is pure, that is noble, that represents the finest ideals of humanity. And I'm sure that within our lifetime, the lifetime of many young people in particular, we will see the fruition of the struggle. Thank you very much.